Pros and cons.
Welcome to Pros and Cons, Engagement Unplugged. I'm Brian Rowley.
And I'm Laura Smith.
And today, Laura and I are actually talking about brand competition. Keeping an eye on competitors is obviously a part of good marketing, and it can help teams understand the category and actually avoid operating in a vacuum. But quite honestly, competitive awareness can quickly turn into competitive obsession, where every campaign, launch, or social post triggers a reaction. So today we're asking how much attention competitors actually deserve.
Okay, so to start off, let's admit that most marketers have experienced a moment when a competitor launches something and someone immediately asks, should we be doing that? So, right, Brian, you've been there, right? Like, oh, you see it, and it's like, should we be doing that?
Yeah.
Especially like the onset of like social and all that, which was crazy. But so what's a competitor move that made you or your team panic a little at some point in your career?
Well, it was when I was in the wireless space. I mean, there was so much competitiveness, right? So you had like at the time, and again, I'll give you this. It's sort of a layup here, but I mean, you had like Sprint, you had AT&T, and you had Verizon Wireless, right? That were all sort of in that play. And I can remember when T-Mobile came into the mix. Everybody was like, "Oh, it's another competitor," and then it was like there was a lot of panic around it. But then it was like one of those things where they had said like, "Oh, well, they're small, they're blah blah blah. Don't worry about them." And then the next thing you know, like we were worried about like T-Mobile as like one of our biggest competitive threats, right? So it's always one of those things, I think, where you're just like, "Whoa, I didn't see them coming," and then next thing you know, they're like right at your doorstep. How about you?
Yeah. I would say it was probably when I was in advertising, working for a big brand, and we kind of came up with a splash and really showed up with a new campaign, and then which made a big kind of stink, right? Like everyone kind of talking about it, all the trades and all that stuff, the industry, and then a competitor, basically, as we probably got a little more comfortable, a competitor came out with this like big campaign launch and splash that just like, it got all the buzz. And it was like, wait a minute, where does that mean we sit? And I will say like, and I think in advertising that happens a lot because it's easily done with like a Super Bowl spot or like some kind of big splash, it's big budgets involved. So clearly people can do big things, but it was definitely like more campaign oriented than it was like a product or a competitor coming into market, I would say. But it was, it puts everyone on their heels. And in the creative business, of course, everyone's like, well, how do we go back and do it better? And so it's the managing of that because that's not always the answer, right? Because I think the interesting thing about the competitive awareness piece of it is we as marketers are very aware, but are consumers as aware? Like, I think that's where we get caught up. Like, it kind of goes back to like, well, we run creative and we're like, oh, I'm so sick of that. Well, we are sick of it. We see it. Like maybe somebody saw it once, in the market. And so it's like the same kind of feeling of like, we feel the pressure, but does anyone else notice it? And in some case they do, I'm sure, but there's friction there, I think.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting. Approach, and for years, I can remember, and I still say it to this day when people are looking at it and they're talking about it. Like, if you think about the amount of work that's created to follow someone like through a competitive launch or something like that, right, and sort of be a moment that's like a follow-on moment versus your own. I've always said like, stick with your strategy. Like, don't get like, I look at a lot of that as distraction. And I look at it and say, like, you can either be incredibly distracted by that, completely pivot, have your teams doing a lot of like this other creative work associated with this, or you can stay your course and learn from it, because I do think there's learnings that you have to pay attention to from competitors, but I don't know that it should be the thing that causes you to shift your course and start in a different direction in probably 90% of the cases.
Yeah, I think it's like there has to be a balance, like calibrated attention, not to pay attention to see like real category shifts in sales and see like if the market is changing, but not enough to let them set your agenda. And I
Right.
think that's right. So I think it's that balance, and you can't become obsessive over it because you have to run your own business. And to your point, like maintain the strategy the business is set out. You can have some admiration or some, like, I don't know, you're a little jealous of what someone else might be doing because maybe it seems cooler or bigger or better. But that doesn't mean you have to change what you're doing. You just need to notice it. And I think it is a little bit of the signal and noise. You have to know the difference between the two. But I feel like, and I don't know how you feel, but where do you think the obsession comes from? Do you think it's internal pressure, like from leadership or sales? Like, where do you think, because do you really think it's marketers, or do you think it's coming from elsewhere?
I think it's driven a lot of different places. I think it's coming from leadership, which is ultimately probably being driven by the markets. Because I think, I still think there's this obsession, and I'm thinking about it more from a marketing perspective, where someone drops something that does actually become a bit viral, right? Which obviously draws attention to the business and awareness and blah, 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 and all those things. But I think at the end of the day, we all would love to have one of those moments. So when you see someone who's successful in that, there's a lot of questions around, why didn't we do that? Or why didn't we, take that same approach? Or, wow, look how, look how much different they are in terms of they're willing to take risks that we're not willing to take. I mean, everything is about taking risks or not, right? And how much do you have a tolerance for the risks that you do take? I mean, that's really what a lot of the competitiveness does boil down to. Some people are willing to push that envelope really far, others aren't. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of factors that play into that competitive approach.
Yeah, I think the evaluating the competitive landscape becomes marketers' jobs.
Yes.
Right, understanding all of it and doing the research and making sure they're up to speed on everything that's happening around their own brand. But I feel like the actual obsession comes from the leadership. Like, I think that's where, because they're not constantly evaluating it potentially, right? Same way they're marketing it. So we might have seen it coming, or we may have been prepared for maybe what's to come, or maybe we're ready to just not do anything. But it's leadership coming in saying, well, they're doing that. What are we doing? We can do something about that? When we respond to that. So, and that just because that's what they're going to be, that's what leadership has to be thinking about the business as a whole. But marketers tend to have more of a pulse on it that ideally, so they're not creating the fires, I don't think. I think they're just waiting to manage them and preparing for those strategically of how to balance it when they see it happening.
Yeah, I think though, going back to the way we kick this off, like that, there is that balance between healthy competition, right? Awareness, right? And obsession. And so I don't think, the obsession piece is the part for me. Like, I agree with you. Like, we look all the time, like, what are our competitors doing? Where are they showing up? Where aren't we showing up? What are the, even when you look at, I've been in a lot of different product roles, like looking at the product set and saying where do they have a competitive advantage for there? But I think also spending time to really understand, and this falls back more into a marketing role, but really being able to articulate, what is your value proposition to your customers? Where does that sit, and how does that stand up against some of the competitive environments, and really being able to be honest with yourselves around, is that really a competitive advantage, or is that just another stake that's in the ground in this particular case? But I do think there's a lot of pieces to it from a marketing perspective where you can balance that and really learn from competitors in terms of where they're really showing up and adding, making an impact.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're in this interesting space where we're joining, and it's well, who are our competitors? And it's we have competitors, but it's not a one-to-one. It's a very, depending on what we're offering, depending on, of course we have people that we're watching in the space and all that, but some brands, it's so much easier to identify your top four. And so I think it's just as a marketer, it's you're always okay, we need to track those competitors. And we've kind of built our own competitive set. But it is a unique, because it's not always an easy one-to-one. So I think some brands and some companies, it's just so much more direct than others. And I think it's you have to think about, you're looking at the market as a whole regardless, right? Just understand, how you position yourself from a marketing and just organizational level. But it's not always cookie cutter, I guess is my point.
Well, and not only I think who your competitors are, but even like if you just look at the dynamics of it, you look at, for example, if we were to look at ourselves versus like a Fortune 500 company, right? Mm-hmm. Like they just have means beyond any means that we would ever have, right? To be able to get some of that messaging that they have or their competitive advantage out there that, their budget is, they spend it on dinner, like what could be an equivalent of what we have for an annual budget, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like you do have to take all of that into account when you're looking at it and just say, where do I make the biggest impact? And I am a firm believer in competitive environments that you cannot be everything to everybody. You need to make sure that you have honest discussions with your team and your internal structure and identify like where is the true value and take that as far as you possibly can. But a lot of folks get tied up in trying to be everything to everybody. And I think that's because they're constantly chasing all the various competitors that they have, trying to weave their message into whatever that competitive set looks like.
And I remember, in the advertising world, like doing quarterly competitive analysis was one of the biggest projects that we had to do for each client. And it was fascinating. I mean, these were like 100+ page decks. Like it was insane, but it was always an interesting process because, you do have to step back and really dig in on some of these to identify their white spaces or so like too much noise, all that. But I think about just being an agency and the amount of money the clients are spending just to have like a team of like 7 to 10 people months on a competitive analysis. And I'm like, that happens multiple times a year. Like, that's like so much work for it. So it's like, I think that like to go back to your point, there's a balance. Like, is it that much time and effort? And now obviously there's things like AI that will help with that and automate and things like that. But it amazes me of how much time I remember spending on those reports and analysis of that. And maybe we'd have like a couple key insights that would take us to a different place. But sometimes it was just like more like learning, and it wasn't a bad thing. Like you learn and you kind of figure it out, but what are you doing with it? And I think that's the piece. And some clients would do something like big with it. And some clients would be like, oh yeah, sure, we'll make that little tweak here. I'm like, that tweak just cost you a lot of money because we spent so much time on building these presentations, which feels like there's got to be a better way, which now I'm sure there is.
Yeah, I do think, and I'm curious for your opinion though, but I do think it's actually become a little bit harder to ignore some of the competitive activity, given the things that we see with like, if you look at it from a marketing perspective, you've got social feeds, you've got blogs, you've got all the monitoring tools, you've got marketing, everything that can be done, like your voice in the market, how much, where does it peak? Where does it, like all of those types of things. So like, would you agree that it's actually harder than it has been in the past to ignore competitors, or do you think it's still pretty easy?
Yeah, no, I think that, I would agree that it's harder to ignore as marketers. But I'll go back to my point earlier that like customers don't see the landscape the way marketers do. So internally, we're fixating on the rivalries, but sometimes the customers are barely aware of what else is around them, So I think there's a gap there. So we as marketers, I think it's harder to ignore, but I don't know if like consumers or buyers or whomever you're like, are they really that they're seeing a lot of activity, but do they notice and compare?
I think it annoys them, to be honest with you. Like I can remember in the Verizon days, nothing was more annoying than like we would launch an ad and then the next thing you know, one of the other carriers would launch one that's very similar saying like, oh, we have the greatest coverage or we have the biggest coverage. And it just used to get so watered down. And it was almost like two kids fighting in a playground, right? It was like, all right, just separate each other, right? Because the only people who are like pounding their chest and this means anything to are the two companies. Everyone else, this is just annoying that you're actually doing this because we all know that the truth is somewhere in between what A is saying and B is saying, right? Like, I mean, it just got crazy.
And I think when it comes to pricing, right? Like I think pricing is a thing that really does matter because, we know that like as like retailers and things like they will just compete with each other. Some retailers say, if you get a better price, bring in your receipt and I'll match that price. So, there's all of that's happening. I think is super important. I even think about like Prime, like Amazon Prime. That's their thing. But this year, maybe it's the first year, I don't know. The Walmart, they didn't call it Prime, but they did the same thing
Yeah.
over different days. I might have done it longer. I forget. But I'm like, oh, I have 2 options now. Like, here I go. But, so Walmart obviously had to follow suit to some degree because they have to keep up. They can't lose the opportunity for sale. So I think that like the pricing battle can be one where you see a lot of that. And then the consumers notice it because they're the ones making the decision to purchase from either the brand they're loyal from or from the price that they want.
Yeah. I guess the other question, though, which is somewhat interesting, is can a brand go too far in that opposite direction and just completely ignore their competitors?
Yeah, but I think that goes back to like, you can't. You have to have the balance approach. Pay attention enough, like notice the signal and noise, like the signal versus noise. You can't ignore. Like, I don't think any marketer could ignore. Because where does that's just, they're going to lose out. You have to be aware. You have to kind of study the market. You have to understand what's going on around you. So it would be silly. And I can't imagine many or any people aren't paying attention to what's around them.
Yeah.
Right?
I completely agree. But then at the same time, there's also, a lot of companies that are out there, there's a lot of research firms that are out there that, to your point, do those very expensive competitive analysis. And you get to the information that you get. And did you really learn a whole lot? Maybe not, right? Like you learned a little, but was it enough that's going to significantly pivot your business for the amount of money that you spent to do it? So I do think there are some things that you don't necessarily need to do. I think your gut tells you a lot around what your competitors are doing. I think your customers, to be honest with you, are probably the best ones to tell you what your competitors are doing right or wrong. And I think if we spent a little more time listening to some of that, I think a lot of people could benefit from that. Because I think that's probably your biggest touch point and probably one of your most valuables.
Yeah, well, I think this was another great discussion, Brian.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think having at the end of it, I think having an eye on your competitors. I don't think anyone would argue the fact that that's an important piece. How you use that as a tool to be able to manage the business moving forward is important. But it's one of many tools that I think you have to do, and I think it's really important to make sure that you don't allow it to have you go off course. I think it's an important piece there, but again, signal and noise, big piece. For those of you that are listening, thank you. And most importantly, if you like what you heard today, be sure and follow us.